Inventing Reality. Section. Auxiliary embellishments. Through the use of various peripheral framing devices, a story can be packaged so as to influence our perception of its content. The most common accoutrements in the print media is, of course, the headline. Not only can headlines mislead anyone who skims a page without reading the story, they can create the dominant slant on a story, establishing a mindset that influences how we do read the story's texts. Thus, it takes a careful reading of a New York Times story headlined, quote, "American flyer shot down in Iraq recounts horrors after capture," end quote, to realize that the pilot is not talking about how he suffered at the hands of his captors, but is voicing his regrets at having delivered death and destruction upon the Iraqi people. When the House Select Committee on Narcotics Abuse and Control investigated drug trafficking in Central America, the Washington Post ran this headline, quote, "Hill panel finds no evidence linking Contras to drug smuggling," end quote. It was false, according to the House Committee's chair, Charles Rangel, Democrat, New York. In a letter the Post refused to publish, Rangel wrote, quote, "Your headline says we drew one conclusion, while in fact we reached quite a different one," end quote. Rather than finding there was no evidence on Contra involvement in drug smuggling, the committee actually determined there was a, quote, "strong need for further congressional investigation into Contra drug allegations." Another Post story, reporting that the income gap separating the rich from the middle class and the poor was wider than it had been in 40 years, carried this upbeat headline, quote, "Number of poor Americans at lowest level since 1980, end quote. Political cartoons and caricatures are also common embellishments, time-honored forms of editorial comment, and readily recognized as such. Less easily detected are the news photographs that often send us a cue about what to think of a story before we get a chance to read it. Acts of violence during labor disputes or anti-war protests are more likely to appear as news photos than less damning shots showing large, disciplined crowds making their point. Individual demonstrators who convey a kooky appearance will more likely catch the camera's eye than those of conventional deportment, the purpose being not to highlight the unusual, but to delegitimate the protesters. Throughout 1989 and 90, whenever demonstrations against communist governments in Eastern Europe were photographed, it was always with long-range shots from an elevated position, giving sympathetic visual emphasis to the size of the crowd. Demonstrations against U.S. government policy in the United States, however, are more likely to be tight cuts of relatively few of the protesters, thereby giving no indication of the immensity of the crowd. Photographs of political leaders can be very political. The President of the United States enjoys almost daily favorable pictorial treatment in the major print and electronic media, and is only rarely pictured unsympathetically. However, favorable photoplay is less likely to be accorded heads of state who have been defined as adversaries. A New York Times Magazine article about Communist Russia by David Shipler, entitled, quote, "Russia, a People Without Heroes," was accompanied by no less than 10 photographs, all of which were unusually muted, grainy, and gray, with thick, ragged black borders, and captions like, quote, "Russians have become so amorphous, so dispersed, because there are no roots, foundations," accompanying a picture of Russians going down an escalator. The photographs accompanying this article conveyed an impression of glumness, oppression, and joylessness, and were clearly meant to do so. A 60 Minutes report on U.S. intelligence work during World War II turned into a Cold War message and a plug for government secrecy. As Harry Reasoner announced, quote, "Today, as we rush to disclose everything, we must remember that some secrets are worth keeping secret." End quote. The screen showed Nazi troops marching past Hitler, then a quick cut to Soviet troops marching in Red Square. Thus, the camera invited us to equate the Soviet Union with Hitlerian world conquest. Whether one agreed with the equation or not, the point is, it was made quite evocatively through a visual effect that evaded rather than encouraged the viewer's critical judgment. Another blatant example of Cold War photo manipulation was provided by NBC's Tom Brokaw, who talked of how the Soviet people had suffered from the crimes of Stalin. As Brokaw spoke, old and familiar newsreel cuts from World War II were shown of a Soviet peasant woman weeping over her son's body. He had been killed by the German invaders. And another shot of 5 Soviet partisans hanged by the Nazis. These were passed off as visuals of Stalin's crimes. It is said that cameras don't lie, but we must remember that liars use cameras. As anyone who has sat through a Hollywood romance or adventure film might know, music is another evocative media embellishment that can play on our feelings. During the Cold War, television news reports on the Soviet Union were often accompanied with tunes that were either mournful or menacing. In the spring of 1984, National Public Radio's All Things Considered did a report on the kinds of music it used as background to its news. An especially dirge-like theme was identified by Noah Adams as used for, quote, sad stories, especially from Eastern Europe, end quote. That Adams saw nothing politically manipulative about using music in this way testifies to the unexamined nature of the political orthodoxy so fostered. Such use of thematic background music is designed to, quote, set the mood, eliciting receptive feelings and deterring resistant thoughts. Newscasters use themselves as auxiliary embellishments. They cultivate a smooth delivery, have trained voices and restrained demeanors, and try to convey an impression of objective detachment that places them above the rough and tumble of their subject matter. Newscasters and, in a different way, newspaper editorialists and columnists affect a knowing, authoritative style and tone designed to foster credibility and an aura of certitude. One recalls A.J. Liebling's caustic observation, quote, "The reluctance to admit ignorance is, with most of the press, as strong as the refusal to accept reality," end quote. So what we sometimes end up with is authoritative ignorance as emphatically expressed in remarks like, quote, "How will this situation end? No one can say for sure." Or, "Only time will tell." Or, "That remains to be seen." better translated as, quote, I don't know, and if I don't, then no one else does. Sometimes the aura of credibility is preserved by palming off trite truisms as penetrating truths. So news people learn to fashion sentences like, quote, unless the strike is settled soon, the two sides will be in for a long and bitter struggle, end quote. And, quote, the space launching will take place as scheduled if no unexpected problems arise. And, because of heightened voter interest, Election Day turnout is expected to be heavy. And, quote, unless Congress acts soon, this bill will not likely go anywhere. End of section.